All right, so are you ready to hop in the time machine today?
Always up for a little time travel adventure. Where are we headed?
This time, we're going back to the final days of AMLO's presidency. It's the end of an era.
AMLO, huh? A fascinating figure, to say the least. What's our source material for this little trip?
We've got our hands on a transcript from one of his very last press conferences.
You mean those legendary Mañaneras he was known for?
The one and only, and let me tell you, it is pure gold.
I can imagine. Those weren't your typical press briefings.
No, not at all.
This was AMLO completely bypassing the media establishment, speaking directly to the people.
Exactly. Raw, unfiltered, and honestly, I think it's essential listening for anyone who wants to understand the man.
And his moment in history.
Precisely. And trust me, this transcript does not disappoint.
What kind of stuff are we talking about here?
We've got AMLO reflecting on his legacy.
Okay, legacy building time.
Sparring with reporters.
Never one to shy away from a good debate.
And even hinting at his retirement plans.
Retirement plans. Now that I'm curious.
Well, let me just say, get ready for some serious reading.
Sounds about right. But let's back up a bit. To really grasp the significance of this transcript, we need to remember the context.
Yeah.
What were AMLO's big campaign promises?
Oh, he campaigned on some pretty major things. Tackling corruption was huge.
Corruption was and is a massive issue in Mexico.
Absolutely. And then there were the social programs, these massive initiatives aimed at reducing poverty and inequality.
Right. He really wanted to shake things up, create a more just and equitable society. And how did that go? Did he deliver?
Well, that's where things get interesting. He actually claimed to have made significant strides in poverty reduction.
Oh, that's a bold claim. I bet that didn't go over well with everyone.
You're telling me. There was definitely pushback, especially given the whole pandemic situation. Critics argued that the numbers were misleading, that the pandemic had actually exacerbated poverty.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's hard to measure progress when you have a global crisis thrown into the mix.
For sure. But just that claim alone, whether you agree with it or not, reveals a lot about how AMLO wanted to frame his legacy.
How so?
He wanted to be seen as a champion of the people, someone who fought for the little guy.
A man of the people. It's a powerful image. And he really leaned into it throughout his presidency, often butting heads with the media in the process.
Oh, absolutely. Remember that time someone threw eggs at him during the campaign?
How could we forget? That's campaign trail gold.
Well, he brings it up in this transcript.
No way. What does he say?
You can tell it still gets to him. He clearly has this complicated history with the press, and he definitely doesn't shy away from calling them out.
Which, honestly, is something we've seen with other populist leaders around the world.
Right. That distrust of traditional media is practically a staple at this point.
It's like a badge of honor. But AMLO, he really weaponized it, you know?
Oh, totally. He used these press conferences to control the narrative, to bypass those critical voices, and connect directly with his base.
And let's be honest, to sidestep some of those tougher questions.
Exactly. He was a master at controlling the message. And speaking of uncomfortable questions, the upcoming election to choose his successor, yeah, that looms large in this transcript.
Of course, a big question. Who will fill his shoes?
Exactly. You can practically feel the anxiety surrounding AMLO stepping down and all the hopes they have for Claudia Sheinbaum, his chosen successor.
It's a lot of pressure to put on anyone's shoulders.
Absolutely. And if she wins, she'll be the first female president in Mexico's history.
Wow. Talk about making history. The transcript hints at both the immense hope and the incredible challenges she would face.
Totally. And then, just when you think there couldn't be any more drama, AMLO goes after the Supreme Court.
Wait, what? The Supreme Court? Tell me everything.
He accuses them of corruption, of blocking his reforms.
Oh, this is juicy.
It's classic AMLO, though, right? Always going after the establishment.
And you have to admit, it's a pretty savvy political move. By positioning himself against the judiciary, he's essentially painting himself as this lone warrior, fighting for the people against a corrupt system.
Exactly. And it plays right into his whole narrative of draining the swamp, of shaking things up and holding the powerful accountable.
It's a tale as old as time. But in AMLO's hands, it feels fresh, exciting even.
He was a master storyteller. But beyond the theatrics, I think it's crucial to understand the context for his attacks on the Supreme Court, especially his push for judicial reform.
You're right, it's more than just a personal vendetta. So What was AMLO's beef with the judiciary? Why was reform so important to him?
Well, AMLO saw overhauling the judiciary as absolutely central to his whole anti-corruption crusade.
He wanted to transform it from the inside out. He believed that a corrupt judiciary was like a disease, eating away at the very fabric of Mexican society.
He actually calls out a specific magistrate in this transcript,
Oh, what'd he do?
accuses him of raking in this massive salary, something totally out of whack with what ordinary Mexicans were earning.
Okay, so we've got that classic populist message of the out-of-touch elite.
Exactly, but it gets even juicier.
Juicier, how so?
He also claims this magistrate was benefiting from a scholarship that was supposed to go to a student.
No way. That's bold, even for AMLO. But you have to hand it to him. He knows how to play to his base.
Oh, absolutely. And this story, it perfectly encapsulates how AMLO used these press conferences to connect with public sentiment. Think about it. A public official earning a ridiculously high salary, allegedly taking advantage of a program designed to help students.
It's like something straight out of a political thriller.
It plays right into AMLO's narrative of this entrenched elite, this system rigged against the average person.
It's classic populism, but it's effective. So what was his solution? How do you fix a system that seems so deeply broken?
Well, he proposed some pretty radical reforms, and one of the most controversial was this idea of a public vote to select judges.
Wow, a public vote for judges. Now that's a power shift.
Right. He really wanted to put the power in the hands of the people. He argued that this would make the judiciary truly accountable to the people they were supposed to serve.
It's a noble goal for sure. But I imagine that didn't sit well with everyone.
You're telling me the legal establishment was up in arms.
I can imagine that's a direct challenge to their authority.
Exactly. They saw it as a blatant attack on judicial independence. They were worried that it would politicize the courts, undermine the rule of law.
It's a valid concern.
It is.
Yeah.
And it really highlights the deep divisions within Mexican society, especially when it comes to the role of government, the balance of power.
For sure. These are fundamental questions about how a society functions, and there are rarely easy answers.
And you know, AMLO, he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He really believed this was about giving a voice to the people who felt like the justice system had failed them for too long.
He often talked about creating a more just and equitable society, where everyone, regardless of their background, had an equal shot. And these judicial reforms were a huge part of that vision.
It's a powerful message, one that clearly resonated with his supporters.
Many saw him as a true champion of the downtrodden. They connected with his passion, his drive to leave a real mark on the system. And that's something you really feel in this transcript, that sense of urgency of a man on a mission.
And speaking of missions, one of AMLO's proudest achievements was his administration's work on poverty reduction. Now, we talked earlier about the debate surrounding the numbers and long-term impact, but in this transcript, AMLO doesn't hold back. He really emphasizes those successes.
It was a cornerstone of his presidency, this idea of uplifting the most vulnerable. He saw it as cementing his place in history as a champion of the people.
But his critics weren't convinced, were they? They argued that those poverty reduction numbers were inflated, that they didn't fully account for the pandemic's effects.
There was definitely pushback. But regardless of where you stand on the numbers, there's no denying that his administration made significant investments in social programs. We're talking expanded healthcare, education, more financial assistance for low-income families.
Programs like Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, which, by the way, translates to Youth Building the Future. It provided job training and apprenticeships for young people.
Okay, so investing in the next generation.
Exactly. And then there was Pensión para el Bienestar de los Adultos Mayores, offering financial support to senior citizens. These were big initiatives with a lot of support.
It sounds like he was really trying to create a safety net for the most vulnerable members of society.
He was. And these programs, they were more than just handouts. At least that wasn't the goal. AMLO's argument was that by investing in people, by empowering them with skills and opportunities, that's what would lead to lasting change, to breaking those cycles of poverty. It was ambitious, for sure.
It was, and incredibly idealistic.
Yeah.
But you have to admire his commitment to social justice, his belief in the power of government to improve people's lives.
Absolutely. Whether his policies ultimately achieved everything he intended, well, that's still up for debate.
It always is with these large-scale social programs.
But you can't deny the impact of his focus on social justice, his commitment to improving the lives of everyday Mexicans. That resonated with a lot of people.
And it's what they'll remember him for.
And this transcript, I think it gives us this fascinating glimpse into his mindset. as his term comes to an end. It's almost like you can feel that weight of history on his shoulders.
Absolutely. And the weight of expectation, too. He knows people are watching, waiting to see what happens next, if the progress he made will stick around. No pressure, right?
Speaking of pressure, let's talk about those famous AMLO battles with the media. He really didn't hold back in this press conference, especially when it came to his economic policies.
Oh, he was never one to shy away from a good sparring match with the press, especially when he felt they were misrepresenting his administration, painting them in a negative light.
He often accused them of being puppets for the wealthy and powerful, more interested in protecting the status quo than reporting the truth.
And let's be fair, there was some truth to that. The media landscape in Mexico has long been dominated by a handful of powerful players with deep ties to the political and business elite.
It's easy to see why AMLO felt the need to go around them, to use those daily press conferences and social media to connect directly with the public.
It was brilliant, strategically speaking. He was able to control the message, cut through the noise, and build that direct line to his base, completely bypassing those traditional media gatekeepers.
And it worked. His approval ratings stayed remarkably high throughout his presidency, consistently outperforming many of his predecessors.
Of course, his critics would argue that he wasn't afraid to resort to populism and divisive rhetoric to get there. They accused him of demonizing his opponents, of undermining democratic institutions.
It's a complicated legacy, no doubt. But there's no denying that AMLO was a transformative figure in Mexican politics.
He was a force to be reckoned with,
Yeah.
someone who defied easy categorization.
Yeah.
You could love him, you could hate him, but you couldn't ignore him.
And this transcript,
What about it?
it captures all of that. It's this raw, unfiltered look at a leader who left an undeniable mark on his country.
It's a reminder that history is rarely neat and tidy.
It's messy.
It's complex.
There are shades of gray everywhere you look.
Yeah.
And as leaders, you're constantly navigating those nuances, making tough decisions, grappling with the immense responsibility of leading a nation.
Exactly. And this transcript doesn't shy away from that complexity. It lays bare those challenges, giving us a glimpse into the mind of a man grappling with the weight of his decisions.
And speaking of challenges, this transcript also gives us a sense of what AMLO's successor would be up against.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about issues that have plagued Mexico for decades. Poverty, inequality, the ever-present threat of drug cartels. These are deep-rooted problems, not easily solved.
And corruption, let's not forget about that. AMLO brought it up constantly throughout his presidency, and it comes up again and again in this transcript. It's like he saw it as this cancer eating away at Mexican society, the root of so many other problems.
And he wasn't just talking about high-level corruption either. He was talking about the everyday corruption that people experience, that erosion of trust in institutions, the sense that the system was rigged against them.
And he took some pretty drastic steps to address it, didn't he? Like those austerity measures, selling the presidential plane, cutting government salaries. It was a powerful message to the people. We're in this together, sharing in the sacrifice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He wanted to show them he was serious about ending those excesses, about changing the culture of government.
And he created new institutions like the Financial Intelligence Unit, which he envisioned as this powerhouse for investigating and prosecuting financial crimes.
So he was trying to build new systems of accountability.
He was. And then there's the Attorney General's office, which he strengthened considerably, giving them more power to go after corrupt officials.
It sounds like he was really trying to shake things up, to challenge the status quo. But the question is, was it enough?
But is it enough to actually make a dent in a problem as deeply ingrained as corruption?
That's the million-dollar question. Corruption is like a hydra. You cut off one head and two more grow back. It's going to take a sustained, multifaceted approach to make a real difference.
But at least AMLO put it on the map, right? He made it a central focus of his presidency.
He did. Whether you agreed with his methods or not, he forced people to confront the issue, to have those uncomfortable conversations. And that in itself is a significant legacy.
Now, another fascinating aspect of this transcript is the way it sheds light on AMLO's approach to the U.S. The relationship between those two countries has always been, well, complicated is an understatement.
It's a relationship built on a foundation of cooperation and interdependence, but also fraught with a history of conflict, intervention, and distrust.
It's a delicate dance, to say the least. And AMLO, he understood this dynamic better than most.
And he wasn't afraid to use it to his advantage.
He wasn't afraid to play hardball when he felt it was necessary. Remember his refusal to allow U.S. forces on Mexican soil to combat drug cartels? That was a bold move, sending a very clear message that Mexico wouldn't be pushed around, even by its powerful northern neighbor.
Right, he basically told them to keep their noses out of Mexico's business.
Which, when you think about the history between these two countries, is huge.
It is. And it wasn't just talk. He backed it up with action, too. Like when he refused to classify drug cartels as terrorist organizations.
Which, let's be honest, would have put a lot of pressure on Mexico to cooperate more closely with U.S.-led efforts to combat them.
Exactly. And he knew that. He saw it as a slippery slope, a potential threat to Mexican sovereignty. So he stood his ground, even when it meant facing criticism both at home and abroad.
It was a high-stakes gamble, but it paid off. It solidified his image as a leader who would stand up for Mexico's interests no matter what.
He was a true nationalist in that sense. He believed deeply in Mexico's ability to forge its own path, to solve its own problems.
And that brings us to another thorny issue that AMLO had to grapple with, the ongoing security crisis fueled by drug cartels.
Ah, yes, the cartels. A problem that has plagued Mexico for decades.
And one that AMLO came into office promising to address. But he also made it clear that he wasn't interested in simply continuing this so-called war on drugs, which many argued had only served to escalate the violence.
So what was his approach?
He wanted to try something different, something more holistic.
What does that even mean when you're talking about something as entrenched and violent as these cartels?
Well, for AMLO, it meant tackling the root causes of violence and crime, not just the symptoms.
Okay, so get to the root of the problem. Sounds good in theory. But how did that translate into actual policy?
It was a two-pronged strategy. On one hand, he ramped up social programs, aiming to provide young people with alternatives to a life of crime.
Give them hope, give them opportunities, that kind of thing.
Exactly. The idea was to create a path out of poverty, to address the despair that often fuels these cycles of violence.
Makes sense. But what about the immediate threat? What about the violence that was already plaguing so many communities?
That's where the National Guard came in.
Ah, the National Guard. That was a controversial one.
To say the least. It was this new security force cobbled together from elements of the military and the police. AMLO saw it as essential to restoring order, to taking the fight to the cartels. But his critics, they saw it as a dangerous step towards militarization, blurring the lines between the military and civilian law enforcement.
They were worried about human rights abuses, about the potential for things to spiral even further out of control.
And it's a valid concern. The jury's still out on whether the National Guard has lived up to its promise. There have been some notable successes, but also some very troubling reports of human rights violations.
It's a reminder of just how difficult it is to tackle a problem like this, how easy it is for even the best intentions to go awry. And it highlights the immense challenge that AMLO's successor would face in trying to bring peace and security to a country grappling with such deeply entrenched violence.
And it's not just about security, is it? There's also the whole issue of migration, which has been a defining challenge for the entire region.
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about Mexico without talking about migration.
And AMLO, he came into office with a very different approach to migration than his predecessors. He was highly critical of the Trump administration's hardline stance, the wall, the family separations. He wanted to try a different way.
So what did that look like in practice? What was his alternative?
Well, he pushed for economic development in Central America, the idea being that if people had more opportunities at home, they'd be less likely to leave. He also worked to create a more welcoming environment for migrants passing through Mexico, setting up shelters, providing food and medical care.
It was a huge shift in policy.
It was, and it didn't come without its challenges or its critics.
What kind of pushback did he face?
Well, he was accused of being too lenient, of not doing enough to secure Mexico's southern border, but he stood his ground. He argued that a compassionate approach was not only the right thing to do, but also the most effective in the long run.
Easier said than done, right? I mean, these are complex issues with no easy answers.
They are, and it's something that AMLO's successor would have to grapple with, this balancing act of addressing the immediate humanitarian crisis while also tackling those root causes of migration.
It's a challenge that has vexed leaders in the region and beyond for decades. But despite all of these challenges, I think this transcript reminds us that there's always hope.
There is, and I think it's that sense of hope, that belief in the possibility of a better future, that really defines AMLO's legacy.
He dared to dream big. He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, to fight for what he believed in. And whether you agreed with his methods or not, you can't deny that he left an indelible mark on Mexico.
He did, and this transcript, it's a testament to that. It's a reminder of the power of one person to make a difference. And as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of AMLO, we leave you with this. What will your legacy be?
What mark will you make on the world?
Thanks for joining us on this journey. Until next time.